Welcome to our 12th episode of On Pilgrimage with Luke. I'm your tour guide, Ray Crafton. Today we continue a look at the unique material in Luke that forms what some have called the heart of the third gospel, the gospel of the lost and the outcast. Today's outcasts are the dishonest manager, who's the principal character in a parable that Jesus tells, and our other outcasts are Lazarus and the rich man, who figure in a story, an exemplary story, that Jesus tells immediately after that of the parable of the dishonest manager. So let's get started. You'll find the parable of the dishonest manager in Luke chapter 16, verses 1 to 15. So if you pause here and take a look at that parable, then restart, and I'll discuss it on the slides that follow. The verses you've just read are unique to Luke's gospel, with the exception of his verse 13 about the servant of two masters. And that material mirrors what we find in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. The rest, however, is unique to Luke. The material you've read seems to contain both a parable ending in the middle of verse 8 and then some follow-on remarks and applications that Jesus makes. And so the parable itself stops with the words, "And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly." The remarks and application begin immediately in the second half of that verse. "For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light." Before we get to the parable and its meaning, I need to make a comment here about the remarks that follow the parable because they show some interesting influences and also some tip-offs about how Luke may have constructed this narrative. And then on the next slide, I need to talk about the agricultural background that the parable assumes because that's key to getting at the meaning of the parable. Focusing for the moment, though, on the remarks that Jesus makes that begin in the second half of verse 8, where some translations talk about the children of this age and the children of light. Actually, the Greek text is masculine. It talks about the sons of this age and the sons of light. And it's important to point that out because those two expressions are very Semitic. And you don't find them in the Old Testament. Where you do find them is in the writing of the Essenes at Qumran, the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So these remarks that Jesus makes seem to have come to Luke by way of an Essene source. Furthermore, when Jesus is shown saying, "And I say to you," that marks the beginning of an independent saying that Luke has brought into the narrative. And it's a tip-off that perhaps what immediately follows was not originally associated with this parable. So it comes to Luke from one of his sources. And finally, there's the use of the Hebrew Aramaic word mammon, which translates as wealth. And that word is, again, not found in the Old Testament, but it's found in Qumran writing. Finally, within Jesus' remarks, that mammon, that wealth, is referred to as being unrighteous. And the language used takes two different forms, one in verse 9, the other in verse 11. The Greek text says in verse 9, refers to it as the mammon of unrighteousness. That's a real Semitic way of referring to ill-gotten wealth. In verse 11, though, the syntax is Greek, where unrighteous is used as an adjective in front of the noun mammon. So Qumran literature has expressions similar to the first, not exactly like it, but similar, where it talks about the wealth of violence and the wealth of evil. So the takeaway from all of this is that Luke appears to have taken a parable of Jesus, the parable of the dishonest manager, and then behind it, he's added these sayings of Jesus that come to him from a different source than the parable did, and that the source for the remarks shows an awful lot of Essene influence. The same kind of influence that we saw early on in the Gospel of Luke regarding John the Baptist, who may have at one time been a member of the Qumran community. Okay, so that's the remarks about the text. Take them as you will. Now let's move on to the agricultural background behind the parable. This is more important, I think, because it helps us understand the meaning. The rich man in this parable was the absentee owner of a large estate called a latifundium. Latifundia could be found all over the Roman Empire of this period, and they were the industrialized agriculture of their time, raising crops in high volumes for export. And these estates highly resemble the plantations that we once had in the American antebellum South, including reliance in some cases on slave labor. The latifundium that Jesus has in mind in this parable is one that would have been prominent along coastal Syria or in the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. This would have been an estate, a plantation, focused on grain, olive oil, and wine production. Latifundia, because their owners, their wealthy owners, tended to be absentee owners, latifundia had on-site managers who were frequently hirelings of the wealthy landowner. And these on-site managers were empowered as the landlord's agent. They assumed responsibility and were empowered to conduct all of the day-to-day activities of the estate, including supervising overseers and slaves, making contracts, including renting out parcels of the estate to tenant farmers and sharecroppers. They were responsible for all phases of production and then for ensuring that that production was sold to warehouse or to market at a good price, and liquidating any debts that had been incurred along the way. And they also, as the landlord's agent, were empowered to make loans. And these loans were made at interest. Now, that's despite the fact that the Old Testament has injunctions against charging interest on loans. By the time of Jesus, Jewish Pharisees, scribes, the Sadducees had argued themselves out of the injunctions found in the Mosaic Law, and so Jews as well as Gentiles were making loans and charging interest on them. Because we're talking about large-scale industrialized agriculture, the on-site manager's accounts, notes, bonds, and all other records would have been kept in writing. Also, I would note that in the parable, while the parable shows the manager interacting with two debtors, the implication, if you read that parable closely, is that there are others. There are just two that happen to be mentioned. And the two that are mentioned are referred to because it gives us an idea of just how large the debts were. Either these debtors had borrowed property that they now had to repay, or they were sharecroppers who owed a chunk of their production to the wealthy landowner. So 100 baths of oil, and that would have been olive oil in this case, equates out to around 600 gallons. 100 cores of wheat happens to be about 600 bushels. So the two debts that are exemplified in the parable are sizable, just as you would expect of an industrialized agricultural operation. In the way that Luke has arranged his material, immediately following the parable, Jesus makes a remark about it and then gives three applications of the story. And the remark he makes is the one found in the second half of verse 8, where he says, For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And that remark could be turned into the following question. What exactly does an outcast like this dishonest manager have to teach good, upright, honest Christians? Well, let's remember humility for a start, because in the Gospel of Luke and in the Gospel of the Outcasts, it's the outcasts who are often our teachers. And one of the lessons that both outcasts and non-outcasts have been teaching us in Luke is the following. And that's that in moments of crisis, we need to stop and reflect on relationships before we act. Among the non-outcasts who teach this lesson, we have Mary, who sits at Jesus' feet and listens to him, rather than Martha, who's distracted and off doing instead of relating. When James and John and their boss were rejected by the Samaritan village at the beginning of Jesus' pilgrimage, you remember that James and John wanted to call down fire from heaven like Elijah did, and Jesus rebuked them. And some of the copies of Luke tell us the nature of the rebuke. Jesus says to James and John, guys, you don't know what spirit you are of. In other words, your attitude is out of kilter because you're out of relationship. You need to come back and reestablish that relationship and get your head straight. Among the outcasts that have been teaching us to stop and reflect about relationships, we had the tax collector versus the Pharisee. The tax collector is definitely an outcast. He's an extortioner, a shakedown artist, a miserable sinner, and not a nice person. And yet, he gets prayer right, and the Pharisee gets prayer wrong. When we looked last week at the prodigal son and his elder brother, here again we have outcasts who teach us about reflecting on relationships before acting. The prodigal son at first gets it wrong because he seizes on his inheritance, severs the relationship, and off he goes. But yet he gets it right eventually, because at death's door he finds himself contemplating how he might reestablish a relationship with his father. And he comes up with a fairly creative idea. He says, I've blown it as a son, but I bet I could get him to take me back as a servant, as a hireling. The elder brother, on the other hand, we don't know whether he ever gets it right or not. He, like the younger brother, goes through self-imposed exile, outcasting, because when his younger brother shows up, he doesn't want to come in. And so he starts cutting the relationship. And the story closes with the loving father trying to reestablish the relationship with his older son. So outcasts are teachers, and in moments of crisis, they teach us to reflect on relationships before acting. Before we go on now to the three applications, I need to add one more bit of agricultural background to the story that might help with understanding the applications. What the dishonest manager does in this story is he does not forgive the debts these debtors have incurred. What he does is he takes his commission out. Now, he's got a pretty substantial commission going here in the way that he has the debtors rewrite their bonds. And it's fairly usurious, but he's clever. His boss is still going to get what the estate is owed, but the manager decides, I'll take a hit. I'll take a short-term hit so that I have a long-term benefit with these people. So, to use Jesus' word, he is being quite shrewd. And so, application number one is think long term. Use what you have now to position yourself. This is what Jesus is saying in verse 9 when he says, "And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes." And what he's talking about here is when we say think long term, he's thinking very long term, as in eternal life. That's the ultimate. And what he's saying you should be using in order to ensure your acceptance into eternal life is use dishonest wealth. Well, that's everything you've got if you think about it, because everything you have now is an unearned gift or it was derived from an unearned gift. Let's go back to life, go back to birth itself. Nobody asks to be born. It's a gift. And everything we have in life stems from that unearned gift. So it's, in that sense, unrighteous wealth. None of what we have is something that we were owed. None of it is something that we own and will hold forever. In that sense, it's unrighteous because it's ephemeral. It's temporal. And Jesus is saying, look, trade that. You can trade that for something eternal. You too can be shrewd. Turning now to application number 2. This is couched in terms of faithfulness versus dishonesty in things both small and great, and it's found in verses 10 to 12. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? To understand what Jesus is saying here, we need to understand the following 4 terms: dishonest mammon or dishonest wealth, true riches, another's goods, and goods of your own. As always, I encourage you to pause the presentation here and to work on these yourself before restarting. And when you restart it, I'll share with you my own thoughts. So what is Jesus saying here? For me, the entry point into this discussion is the term dishonest mammon or dishonest wealth. Because in the preceding application, we identified this with all of the things of earthly life. In a parabolic or exaggerated sense, all that we have in this life is dishonest in the sense that we've obtained these things by virtue of having life, and the life we have was not earned. It was given to us. So if dishonest mammon is seen in this light, then real wealth, its opposite, consists of eternal life. In the same way, the term another's goods represents what has come our way by virtue of earthly life. We own none of it, because none of it will go with us into eternal life. So therefore, the opposite of another's goods are the goods of our own, and that represents, again, eternal life. So it's odd, I think, that we usually consider our earthly possessions as things we have earned. But in this application, Jesus turns that thinking on its head. He says all earthly possessions are unearned because our earthly life was never earned. In contrast, he tells us, we can do something to earn eternal life. That, he says, can be honestly earned and truly our own. And so what is that we have to do or can do to earn eternal life? Jesus says it's about being faithful. If we put our mindfulness into our relationship with God, and then let our use of earthly possessions grow from that, then we have made a shrewd trade of earthly wealth for true riches. All of this, to me, begins to sound like the model of prayer that I derived a few weeks ago from Luke's narrative. If we begin, as in there, if we begin with contemplation of our relationship with God, and let that form our thoughts and feelings, and let those in turn drive our actions, then we're on our way to trading short-term for long-term benefits. This dichotomy of true and false and separating them by way of a faithful relationship with God is something that Thomas Merton wrote about in Seeds of Contemplation, where he said, "Every one of us is shadowed by an illusory person, a false self. This is the man that I want myself to be, but who cannot exist, because God does not know anything about him, and to be unknown of God is altogether too much privacy. My false and private self is the one who wants to exist outside the reach of God's will and God's love, outside of reality and outside of life, and such a self cannot help but be an illusion." Merton goes on to write, "The secret of my identity is hidden in the love and mercy of God. But whatever is in God is really identical with him, for his infinite simplicity admits no division and no distinction. Therefore, I cannot hope to find myself anywhere except in him. Ultimately, the only way that I can be myself is to become identified with him in whom is hidden the reason and fulfillment of my existence. Therefore, there is only one problem on which all my existence, my peace, and my happiness depend: to discover myself in discovering God. If I find him, I will find myself, and if I find my true self, I will find him." Moving on now to the third application that Luke places after the parable of the dishonest manager. This is a bit of cue material shared with Matthew, and it's a blunt statement that each of us must make a choice between maximizing the short term on earth versus the long term in heaven. Maximizing both are not possible. The great reversal means that to maximize one is in some sense to minimize the other. This saying of Jesus was so vivid that it found its way not only into Matthew and Luke's Gospels, but even into the Gospel of Thomas, which reads, "No one can mount two horses or bend two bows, and a slave cannot serve two masters. Otherwise that slave will honor the one and offend the other." Nearly all of the rest of Luke's chapter 16 is made up of the story of Lazarus and the rich man. So if you'll pause here and read chapter 16, verses 19 to 31, we'll take up that story next. Lazarus and the rich man is one of those stories unique to Luke that's so powerful that it's inspired a great deal of artwork. And I show here two paintings by James Tissot from his series, The Life of Christ. At left, we have the pauper Lazarus at the rich man's door, and at the right, the evil rich man in hell. In the left-hand picture, Lazarus, seated at the door stoop of the rich man's rather commodious house, begs, surrounded by the dogs that are licking his sores and in the company of other beggars. While on the right, we have the rich man in the flames reaching up and talking to Father Abraham across the chasm that separates them. And while they can see one another and hear one another, Father Abraham can do nothing for the man in the flames. Behind Father Abraham, we find Lazarus at last receiving eternal comfort. And so let us turn now to a discussion of this extremely powerful story. First, some observations, mostly about the text itself. None of the ancient copies of Luke that we have name the rich man, except one, and it happens to be the oldest manuscript of Luke that we possess. It's a manuscript called P75. It says that the rich man's name was Nues. Now, nobody's been able to come up with a good reason for that. On the other hand, Lazarus has a name that's a variant of the Hebrew or Aramaic El Hazer, meaning God has helped. And certainly that's evocative of what happens in this story, where God does step in and help. Lazarus, who has a physical condition in this life and who's at the bottom of society, becomes the beneficiary of the great reversal, and God has helped. The rich man and Lazarus form another one of Luke's pairs, very much like the loving father's two sons in a previous story, the story of the prodigal son. Lazarus is described as desiring to be fed, and those are exactly the same words that are used about the younger son, the prodigal one, in that story. The rich man belatedly plays the relationship card by calling upon Father Abraham. And so he calls upon Abraham as father, just as the sons do in the earlier story. And Abraham responds by addressing the rich man in hell as child, which was also the same form of address that the loving father used when he addressed his older son, when he was cajoling the older son to come into the tent. So Lazarus and the rich man very much parallel the younger and the older son, respectively, in the earlier story. I should mention a couple things here. Lazarus' sores are evidently not leprosy, otherwise he would not have been in public. And in life, the rich man was aware of Lazarus because he recognizes him later in the afterlife. So that's the problem for the rich man and why he's on the losing end of the great reversal. In this life, he knew about Lazarus' condition, could have done something about it, and didn't do something about it. In verse 22, we have a couple of curiosities. One is the angels carrying Lazarus, and the second one is where they carry him to. That's described as Abraham's bosom. Well, unlike the rich man, who is buried with full honors in the text, there's no indication that Lazarus was ever buried, and apparently he was not, because the role of the angels in this story mimics a Greek belief about Hermes as collector of the unburied. And left unburied, Lazarus' corpse would have been scavenged by the dogs. And that's why in the story, not only are the dogs licking the sores just there for dramatic impact, they're essentially indulging in an appetizer. They're getting a taste of what they're going to eat in its entirety later on, i.e. Lazarus' entire body. Dogs were kept in this culture as watch animals and also as shepherding animals. They, in urban settings, were part of the garbage disposal system. They ate the garbage that was left on the streets, and they did eat corpses. For evidence of that, I've given you some citations here to 1st and 2nd Kings, where that's exactly what goes on. Pretty gross. Abraham's bosom suggests either intimacy or a place of honor at a banquet. The Gospel of John has examples of this. In chapter 1 of the Gospel of John, verse 18, the evangelist wrote, "No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's bosom, who has made him known." The other way of looking at that expression of Abraham's bosom as being a place of honor at a banquet, that also has an illustration in the Gospel of John in chapter 13, where it says that the disciple whom Jesus loved reclines with him at dinner and is on Jesus' bosom. The role of the angels in this story and the reference to Abraham's bosom, those things are not found in Jewish or Christian writing prior to Luke. They do show up later on in the 2nd century, but Luke seems to have used them earlier than anyone else. By the way, I find the imagery of the place of honor at a banquet, that way of thinking of Abraham's bosom, I find that particularly compelling here because it fits right in with the rest of the story, where in earthly life, Lazarus desires to be fed from the rich man's table. And then in the afterlife, there's the great reversal where Lazarus is taken to heaven and the rich man winds up in the flames. So a place of honor at the heavenly banquet, I think, is a particularly evocative way of thinking about that. Overall, the story here does have a strong resemblance to both folk tales and Jewish legends. There's an Egyptian story, an Egyptian folk tale that about the afterlife that's very similar to this story of Luke's. And later on, after Luke wrote this, there were Jewish legends that sound a great deal like it. In our story, the rich man winds up in Hades, in the afterlife. And so as your tour guide on this pilgrimage, I would be remiss if I did not take us on a brief tour of Hades, or as the Greek text would have us pronounce it, Hades. Hades was the name of the Greek god of the underworld, and his name eventually came to refer to the grave, or more broadly, to the entire abode of the dead. When the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek, Hades was the Greek word that was used to translate Sheol, Sheol being the Hebrew word for the abode of the dead. And in the Old Testament, in several different places, the text gives us some ideas of what the Jewish conception of the afterlife was like, what was Sheol like. Psalm 89 tells us that that's where all human beings go after death. Isaiah described it as a place of shadowy existence. Another psalm says it's a place of waiting and inactivity. And the book of Job describes it as being located below the waters of the ocean. When the Jews came back from exile, and under the influence of the book of Daniel, some additional ideas and imagery was added to the understanding of what Sheol was like. It became also a place of fiery retribution for sinful earthly conduct. So the unrighteous became punished in Sheol. The way this was accomplished was Sheol became divided into 3 locales, and these were separated by a chasm, by water, and by light. And in our story, you can see how the unrighteous rich man in the flames is separated from the righteous up in heaven with Father Abraham by a chasm. And like in our story, the Jewish understanding of Sheol was that the occupants of these different locales would be able to see each other and even to converse with one another, but unable to cross from one locale to another. And so in our story, we have Father Abraham carrying on a conversation with the rich man, but unable to do anything to help him cross over from one place to the other. The story of Lazarus and the rich man graphically illustrates lessons that Luke has been teaching throughout his gospel. The first of those is that the great reversal is coming, and that forewarned is forearmed. We have on the one hand Lazarus, who is poor, who now enters the kingdom of heaven in the afterlife. We have Lazarus, who was hungry in this life and would have been content with the scraps falling from the rich man's table. In the afterlife, he finds himself sitting at the place of honor next to Abraham at his banqueting table. In contrast, the rich man, his consolation is limited to this life, and there is no more once he dies. And although he's full now in this life, in the afterlife, he finds himself hungry. Actually, in the story, he finds himself thirsty and asks Abraham to send Lazarus with water to cool his tongue. As far as a moral to the story, it recaps and illustrates what Jesus remarked after the parable of the dishonest manager. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest mammon, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal tents. That's what the rich man could have done and didn't do, and suffered the consequences. So what the rich man could have done was, earn his salvation through holistic reaction. He knew about Lazarus and Lazarus' condition, and yet did nothing about it. He could have reacted with his heart, being, mind, and strength, by listening to his God and by being mindful of the relationship with his God. It could have informed his thinking and feeling and his actions, but it didn't. And the action that was missing was mercy towards the victims in life, those in a physical condition. Those are the ones who are blessed. Finally, the story winds up with a note of consolation to the church of Luke's time, when it says that the rich man asks Abraham to send Lazarus to the rich man's brothers to amend their lives and warn them of the wrath to come. And Abraham says, well, even if somebody rises from the dead, they won't believe. And that's a reference to what happens with Jesus rising from the dead, to the Jewish opponents not believing and continuing to oppose the church. So it essentially explains what Paul describes as one of the mysteries, that the chosen people have not gotten on board with the Messiah. And Abraham's statement at the end of the story is that they have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them. That's what it would take. That's what it should take for them to believe and to behave in a righteous manner. So once again, we get the Lucan theme of listen. Listen to what God has said. Thanks for joining us. Next week, we'll take up the last two episodes in Luke's Gospel of the Lost and the Outcast. The first of these will be the story of Zacchaeus, which takes place in Jericho on Jesus next to the last stop before he enters Jerusalem. And the final story, one that Luke shares with Mark, is or takes place after Jesus enters Jerusalem, and he observes a widow contributing all that she has to the temple treasury. Hope to see you then, and until then, peace.